Hello, everyone. I'm Jacob Beranek. I'm a composer, currently studying at the Juilliard School in New York City. I'm pursuing my master's in composition. I want to talk a little bit today, or a lot of it really, about the first symphony of a composer very near and dear to my heart, Bohuslav Martinu, in kind of in anticipation of an upcoming performance of this much neglected work at Alice Tully Hall by the New York Philharmonic in February. Now, I'm giving this presentation again in the comfort of my own home, but I did give this earlier this day during class at Juilliard, but I also wanted to represent it to save it on YouTube. So we'll see how this goes remotely. I have a presentation all queued up here. All right. I have to start with this quote because it is so striking to me when, at least when I consider musical history in America, this never fails to surprise people. This is in an article in the Musical Times, and it says, in part, perhaps the most successful European émigré composer working on the American East Coast during the 1940s. Now, if I had to pick one without knowing anything that I do now, I would have to say Bartók is the most successful European émigré composer on the East Coast. You know, there was Hindemith, there was Milhaud, but you know, as far as success goes, Bartók, you know, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, they were on the West Coast. Except the composer I'm going to talk about said this: Mrs. Bartók was very unhappy that his music is completely ignored and my music is played all the time. Now, who would have the nerve to say, well, clearly Mrs. Bartók had the nerve to say that, but who on earth could have music played more than Bartók, a cornerstone of 20th century music? Who would dare say Bartók's music was completely ignored? Well, it was. And the composer whose music was played all the time is Bohuslav Martinů. Bohuslav Martinů. Now, Mr. Martinu, note that little circle on the U is not an umlaut. This is a Czech name, and it just means to hold that U a little longer. Every word in Czech has stress on the first syllable, so Bohuslav Martinů, and you just hold the U a little longer. Now, the class that I just gave this presentation in is called the American Symphony, taught by Dr. Wayne O'Quinn. Now, the question, of course, I had to ask in class was, why am I talking about Martinu for the American Symphony? I just said he was Czech. Well, Martinu lived in America for many years, and he actually had never written a symphony before coming to America. And then he wrote all of his symphonies while in America. And this is significant, I think. Even though Martinu himself was perhaps not an American through and through, all of his symphonies are American symphonies. That really carries some weight, I think, because he didn't take his American status for granted. There was something about coming to America that made this man of 51 years at the time write symphonies and write only American symphonies. He never again wrote a symphony after he left America. He also taught at Mannes, Princeton, and Curtis, so he had some connection to American music education. And he really did enjoy, as we'll see, a widespread but sort of a short-lived popularity that I think shows that he spoke to an era. Those 1940s and 50s, he was intensely popular with critics and audiences alike. And there is something about his music that really captures that era, I guess. I'm amazed when you start looking into what was written about Martinu, what people were saying. Perhaps one of the most shocking is from the Journal of the American Musicological Society, spring 1950. This is a quote. It's kind of a promo ad by Boozy and Hawkes that featured Martinu. And there's this quote from the composer and critic Virgil Thompson specifically about Martinu's symphonies. It says, "To Martinu alone among contemporary masters has it been given to elevate the symphonic tone." In other words, Martinu, in Thompson's estimation, was the greatest living symphonist in the world in 1950, or at least the one most able to elevate the symphonic tone. That's really quite a shocking statement, considering that Thompson himself had written 2 symphonies by this time. So we already know Martinu was held in high regard. As far as him being American or not, he wrote this to his family in 1945. They already think of me as a Czech-American composer. Less than 4 years, or over 4 years, I suppose. And he was considered Czech-American. At least that's what he told his family in Polička. Now, his family in Polička. Let's talk a little chronology about Martinu. He was born December 8th, 1890 in Polička, Bohemia. There I am several years ago outside of Martinu's birthplace. Now, he was born in the church, the Svatý Jakub church. Of course, I love that because my name in English is Jacob, but in Czech it's Jakub. So that he was born in the Jakub church is wonderful. But he wasn't just born in the church, he was born in the steeple. His father was the town watchman. And so he was born in the steeple of the church. Now, a little bit of fun musical trivia. December 8th was also Sibelius's birthday. So Martinu was born on Sibelius's 15th birthday. Sibelius was born in 1875. Martinu grew up, became quite good at the violin. He studied at the Prague Conservatory from 1906 to 1910, violin, but he was expelled for incorrigible negligence. He was a negligent student. But that's all right, because what he wanted to do was compose. And compose he did. His first orchestral work, Czech Rhapsody, was premiered to pretty great acclaim by the Czech Philharmonic in January of 1919. He had written it in 1918 for the creation of Czechoslovakia, which had happened in November of 1918. October of 1918. And he really kind of catapulted to a kind of minor Czech fame with this piece. It's one of those rare instances in music history where a composer really has not heard his work played much, and all of a sudden he writes an orchestral piece. And this is no orchestral piece. This is mixed chorus, baritone. Really, quite an ordeal. He writes his first orchestral piece, and it's premiered by pretty much the best orchestra that he could get his hands on, the Czech Philharmonic. Same thing happened with Aaron Copland, with his symphony for organ. He had never heard a note of his music before, and suddenly the Boston Symphony was playing it. But what is even more rare is the fact, and I don't know of any other composer that did this, the fact that Martinu made his big break compositionally with the Czech Philharmonic, and then was accepted into the second violin section as a performer. And he played with the Philharmonic for several years under Václav Talich, toured with them. So he was a capable violinist. In 1923, he moved to Paris, and he studied with Albert Roussel, who I've heard kind of described as a French Brahms. He was a bit of a foil to the likes of Debussy. And Martinu really credits Paris in general, I think, with helping him find his true musical voice. He wanted to escape desperately what he called German metaphysics, which were in vogue at the time in Prague. He felt basically long, overblown, grandiose, think Mahler, Strauss, Wagner, I guess. And he wanted to get away from that. He felt a true Czech character was restrained, calm, clear. And he found sympathetic notions of that in Paris. And so he said, I went to France to find my Czechness, basically. Now, the strange thing is, though, for a young man starting off in Paris, he really didn't have much contact with the big names there. We don't think he ever met Stravinsky, even though he really admired Stravinsky. He met Boulanger and Copland, couple times. He didn't really do much with Les Six, the group including Poulenc and Honegger. He kind of founded his own group, actually, Groupe de Quatre, which involved him and Mihalovitsy and Conrad Beck and one other composer. So he was kind of out of touch, I suppose you could say, with what one thinks of Paris 1920s. That being said, he did certainly dabble in all the experimental trends, but emerged with a very crystallized, clear form. He then came to America. There he is with the Boston Symphony. And then he moved around France, America, Italy, Switzerland. He taught at the American Academy in Rome. And eventually he died in Liestal, Switzerland on August 28th, 1959, a couple months short of his 69th birthday. Now, here's a photo I took a few years ago in Policzka. It's just a neat shot. He's buried in Policzka, even though he died in Switzerland. His remains were moved there in the 70s, I believe. And so here's his grave in the foreground. And in the background, you see the Svatý Jakub Church, where he was born. So there's his birthplace right over the clock and his final resting place in one shot. Now, Martinu was extremely prolific. 16 operas, 15 ballets, 28 concertos, 8 string quartets, 7 cantatas, 6 serenades, an oratorio, 19 sonatas or sonatinas, 6 symphonies, 5 of which were written in 4 years. If we look at this now, just kind of chronologically, look at the names he was writing for too. Symphony number 1, Boston Symphony and Koussevitzy, then Cleveland, then back to Boston, then Philadelphia, Ormandy, then the Czech Philharmonic. Then here's a couple non-symphony, they're symphony-esque works. The Symphonia Concertante, number 2, which is a fantastic work, 3 movements, probably my favorite orchestral work of Martinu. That was done by Paul Sacher in Switzerland. Then the Sinfonietta La Jolla for California, and then back to Symphony number 6 with the Boston Symphony. That was after Koussevitzy died. That was Charles Munch. But I mean, that's astonishing, that productivity. But then you look at the other orchestra pieces he wrote in between. It's astonishing. A concerto for 2 pianos and orchestras and a second violin concerto between the first and second symphonies. The Memorial to Lidice for the New York Philharmonic. Then a piece for the National Symphony, the Dallas Symphony, a ballet for Martha Graham, which, of course, Copland had made a big name with Appalachian Spring. 2 operas, for one premiered by Interlochen, one by NBC, a viola concerto, a double concerto. I mean, this is just extraordinary. And they were all performed by major orchestras. I mean, it's just really quite extraordinary. There's a quote from the critic of the New York Times in the day, Owen Downs. He comments on this exact phenomenon. Probably no one of Martinu's contemporaries today producing so much music is producing so much music which finds its way so quickly into the repertory. It could be suspected that this fact connoted a composer who produced easily, fluently, and with a dangerous facility. This is not the case. Martinu has a brilliant and practical technique, but he is incapable of an unthorough or conscienceless job. He works very hard, systematically, and scrupulously, and modestly. He produces so much music because, in the first place, his nature necessitates this. I think that's a really intriguing sentence. He has to write music. In the second place, he knows his business and he loves it. Now, I particularly like that last sentence because it echoes one of my favorite quotes of Martinu, which was written in his diary in 1945. Craft means not only technique, but also a love for one's profession. I think that is beautiful. But Owen Downs, a very influential critic, certainly didn't think Martinu was being facile, writing so much, or unthorough. I mean, he took the time to write a feature for him when Martinu turned 60, so that says something in and of itself. Juilliard's own David Diamond was a very, very close friend of Martinu. In fact, he sublet Martinu's apartment for a year, 28 West 58th Street, I believe. The brownstone is no longer there, but they were very good friends. And there's this quote from a Martinu in America documentary. Diamond says, Bohuslav once told me that once he would walk down 6th Avenue, he could already hear an entire piece that he wanted to compose. When he got back to the apartment, in one day, he would be able to get the whole piece written down. He could absolutely write out an entire orchestral score without depending on testing the chords on the piano. I find this extraordinary. Well, Mr. Diamond, I do too. Now, of course, there are going to be some people that either didn't read these testimonials or disregarded them. And unfortunately, that is the case with the first big biography of Martinu in English, which is the Martinu by Brian Large, 1975. It includes this quote: "With a catalog of nearly 400 scores, Martinu surely must have been one of the most prolific composers of his day. Yet in some ways, this vast output has been the cause of some of the criticism. That Martinu's output is uneven and that he was one of the least critical composers of the century cannot be disputed." Well, I'm afraid Ollendowns disputed that. How could he have produced such a collection of works? Now, the answer here comes from a man named James Rybka, Dr. James Rybka, who wrote this book called The Compulsion to Compose, a sort of alternative biography. Now, Mr. Rybka, Dr. Rybka, was a personal friend of Martinu. Martinu lived with Rybka's family when Rybka was a boy, and he visited Martinu later in life too, as he was a young man. So he had lots of firsthand experience with Martinu, and this is an extraordinarily passionate, full of zeal, well-researched book. It's not always the most well-written, but it makes up for it in sheer devotion to Martinu and the truth. So Brian Large asks, how else could Martinu have produced such a collection of works? Well, Rybka says, "We believe that Martinu was born with Asperger's syndrome, AS, which directed his developing young brain toward music. But as he grew, it also stunted his social awareness, caused him to become withdrawn and set apart from other children. Throughout his lifetime, Martinu had to struggle with social difficulties from his psychological disorder. Then, after he died, his prolific output became misinterpreted to be a mark of carelessness, and this badly damaged his reputation." Now, whether you agree with that or not, there is certainly evidence that Martinu was, had savant-like abilities to compose, and he also was infamously quiet. There are countless, myriad testimonies of, he wouldn't say a word when everybody else talked with him. Probably one of the most shocking was when Elman wanted to commission him to write a violin concerto for him. And he went over and played for Martinu, and he played for, I don't know, an hour, and Martinu barely said anything. He barely said anything. Here was this great violinist playing for him, and he just let him play, and then he walked him to the door and bid him a good day, and that was it. And Elman was quite offended by this, as anyone would be. And then all of a sudden, a few months later, here's a full score in the mail of a violin concerto by Martinu dedicated to Elman. That's just how he was. Another more humorous anecdote, I suppose, comes from his time at Princeton. When Martinu taught at Princeton, he was, of course, the whole music faculty got together to give him a tour of the campus on his first day. And you can imagine this was probably a couple hours, and a lot of people that Martinu would have been trying to not necessarily ingratiate himself to, but these are his colleagues, and they're showing him around campus. And two separate professors have corroborated that Martinu said not a single word for the entire tour. He didn't say one word until the very end. They kind of look at him and, well, is he going to say something? And he says one word: Manhattan. Now you can imagine how confused everybody was. Manhattan? What does he mean? Does he want to go home? And he said it again: Manhattan. And then one of the professors, I think it was Ed Cohn, said, "Do you mean you want a drink? You want a Manhattan?" And Martinu says, yes, let's go to the bar. And so then they all went to the bar and had some Manhattans. But yes, infamously quiet. Two quotes from a couple other important musical figures. Aaron Copland once remarked to David Diamond, you know, that man Martinu has a quiet about him that is very impressive. And Milton Babbitt, who also taught at Princeton for an astoundingly long time, and also at Juilliard, commented in a letter to Dr. Rybka, as he was researching for his book, I saw Martinu occasionally, but he obviously derived no great pleasure in talking about music or the teaching of music, and probably therefore I recall not a single word of significance or insignificance that passed between us. Now, of course, I have to push back a little bit on Dr. Babbitt here, because perhaps Martinu didn't derive great pleasure from talking about music per se. I mean, you know, English was his third language, so he wasn't much of a talker anyways. But he did derive great joy from his compositions and from music and from thinking about music. This we have copious proof of, thanks to the work of a wonderful scholar, Thomas Svatoš, in this wonderful new book, a few years old now, his first ever translation into English of Martinu's American diaries, the diaries that Martinu kept while he was in America. And this book, as far as I'm aware, is wholly unique as far as the material we have for understanding a composer, what a composer thought about. You know, Schoenberg, of course, wrote textbooks, and Hindemith did, of course, too. And they explain their musical language to a certain extent, but this is different. This is Martinu at his most personal, at his most raw. It's really what's on a composer's mind, talking about what fuels his music, what he thinks about. This is a gold mine for any musicologist, music theorist. If you like Martinu's music or not, if you disagree with his ideas or if you agree with them, it is simply an alternate perspective from what is largely taught today by a composer composing at a very important point in history. It's fascinating. He talks about, among other things, the creative process. He talks extensively about what he calls a feeling for the whole, which for him was, before a composer starts writing, the composer needs to have a sense of what a piece wants to do, what it is. It's kind of this ideal that the composer has to attain. He says, for example, why do composers look for a specific motive or change it and discard it? He challenges the oft-held notion that a composer looks for a motif to begin a piece, you know, and then from that motif springs the piece. What he's saying is actually the composer already knows subconsciously, calls this subconscious concentration. They bring into focus this sort of sense of the composition. And then what they're subconsciously doing when they're checking a motif out and testing it is seeing if it corresponds to their understanding of what they're about to write. And this is fascinating. This totally changed how I thought about music, or at least confirmed some suspicions I already had. So, of course, he talks a lot about Gestalt, this idea that you know, the sum is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. He develops a new system of analysis too. He felt that the cookie cutter ABACA analyses missed the point. He says at one point, they turn the piece over to a laboratory, and it takes the creative joy that a composer feels and a listener feels when hearing a composition. And he said that completely opposes how I understand music. I don't think it should be a bunch of numbers and letters. But then, of course, what's the alternative? And he even admits, well, this is sort of subjective, but he tries anyways to come up with an alternate way of understanding music, which he feels is more authentic. This is a system of analysis he calls variable and invariable. And this, in my own research, during my undergraduate years at Vanderbilt University, I wrote a thesis specifically on this. As far as I know, it's the first academic application of Martinu's new system of analysis. I analyzed the second movement of Martinu's Second Symphony according to his analysis, which there again, just a gold mine for new research. And I urge anyone listening to this to to look into this and to do further research if they're interested. Now, of course, he's distrustful of critics and their emotional readings of music too. So it's kind of a Goldilocks syndrome, if you will. He doesn't like the uber technical, and so Babbitt and serialism was not appealing to him. But he also doesn't like the uber romantic. He thought they just read into music too much, that there was too much a sort of, someone would say, oh, well, Martinu wrote the scherzo while he was living in New York, so you can hear the hustle and bustle of New York life in this. He would say, absolutely not. He says, page 126, the idea that the audience lives through the composer's emotional experience is groundless. Groundless. So he had some strong feelings. He has this big problem with the idea of having a message too, which makes the artist feel like a benefactor of humanity, he says. This idea comes from sentimentality, self-pity, and selfishness. It is the natural result of the post-romantic outlook. Not Bach, Haydn, Mozart, and not even Beethoven, I'm sure, who already lived at the beginning of the age of megalomania. None of these artists considered themselves benefactors of humanity. Now, that is a bold statement, but he felt strongly. Then again, having a message is perfectly acceptable as long as it's not predetermined, which places the composer in a false state of mind. There is a great difference between doing something naturally and forcing oneself to do it. So that was really at the crux of his issue here. He felt that when a composer said, okay, I'm going to write about X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to set up this form, and it's going to go like this, he felt that was forcing oneself, one's ego, onto a piece of music. And he was adamantly against that. He talks about self-forgetting, for example. The composer creates in the moment he forgets himself, not when he intellectually forces his idea, medium, or when he wants to express his ego consciously. The composition often develops very differently from his conscious plan. Over the course of his creative activity, the composer gets stopped, writer's block, when he wants to force or steer his way through a given form in a way that does not create a complete whole. Ding, ding, ding. There's our little whole, our gestalt. Or his feeling for the inner organic relations. In other words, when you're trying to force a piece in a direction that the music does not want to go, the music itself will rebel against you. I think that's kind of what he's saying. There are other points where he talks about form and musical composition as living organisms. So this was not a score. For him, it was not notes on the page. It was an entity unto itself that he was trying to bring to life and just show performers how to do it. Really astounding. See, this is what I mean. This is an understanding of music that is rarely discussed, but perhaps something that a lot of composers understand. I certainly had this hunch, and it was explained to me somewhat during my time at Vanderbilt by Professor Carl Smith, who worked this into his lectures. But besides Professor Smith, I hadn't really realized what was happening when I was composing, and Martinu explains this beautifully. Now, enough talking about Martinu. Let's hear what he has to say about himself. I'll just play a minute of this. This is an interview from 1942 in New York, talking about what a joy it is to be in America and the influences on his music. Then we'll get into the First Symphony.
Mr. Martinu, I suppose it is needless for me to ask how you feel about being in the United States, but perhaps you would like to express yourself on that subject first.
As a Czech, I am, in a practical sense, a man without a country. It is one of few blessings left in life to find at least one place in the world where freedom exists for the artist and his art to survive. I cannot tell you what it means to have the privilege of being here in America with you.
And we cannot tell you how glad we are to have you here with us, Mr. Martinu. It is also especially gratifying that you can be present during this concert of your music to tell us something about your work in your own words. I notice that your music is generally spoken of as having individualism. To what extent do you consider that true?
This is very flattering, but I think it's correct. However, as you know, a composer's styles can become influenced by many things.
Well, in your case, what have been the major influences?
There seems to be three. First, I would say the national music of my own country, Czechoslovakia. The second comes from the English madrigal, and the third from Debussy.
I would add a fourth influence to that list. Certainly, there are elements of Czech, specifically Moravian folk song in Martinu's music, not necessarily in quotation of themes per se, but in the certain melodic contour. It's kind of the same with Bartók in his lyrical moments. You can feel the influence of the regional folk idioms, but it's not necessarily direct quotation. The English madrigal, yes, absolutely. In terms of the freedom of the polyphony, we know Martinu loved that. It was a shock for him, having only known Bach and then hearing some madrigal singers in Prague when he was a young man, opened up a whole new world. Debussy, certainly in his orchestral sounds and his treatment of harmony. But I would add also concerto grosso form. This idea of featuring instruments, a large group and then a small group, back and forth, contrast and familiarity, what is called ritornello form. We know Martinu was definitely influenced by Baroque forms, and that created a certain unorthodox understanding of music, at least compared to sonata allegro form or something like that was popular in the Romantic eras and classical eras, of course. What strikes me about Martinu, though, when you're looking at this, is he has this sort of Brahmsian kind of compilation of everything that went before him. Renaissance, Baroque. He talks a lot about classical balance and aesthetics. He distanced himself from Romanticism, but only certain types of Romanticism. You certainly hear a certain chromatic harmony and melodic lyricism that wouldn't have been possible without the Romantic era. And then a myriad modernist things that he picked up either in Paris or what have you. I mean, the sheer fact that he put it together, he's a fascinating, unique composer. So let's see, what does his music sound like? Well, I'm going to talk today about the first symphony, which is, I think, one of the least performed out of Martinu's symphonies. Of course, none of them are really performed that much. But I had written about the second symphony prior, and so I wanted to tackle a symphony that I hadn't considered before. And it was his first symphony in America. Anyways, so a little background on the symphony before we talk about music. The story of this symphony really has to go back to Serge Koussevitzy, the longtime conductor of the Boston Symphony. Koussevitzy was Russian by birth, but he lived in Paris for a while before he immigrated to America to conduct the Boston Symphony in 1924, I believe. And shortly thereafter, when he was already conductor of the Boston Symphony, the story goes, at least, and I have no reason to doubt this, that Martinu was walking down the street one day, and he happened to have the score of his most recent orchestral piece with him, and he spots Koussevitzy sitting alone at a cafe. And apparently, Martinu just walked right up to him point blank and said, "Maestro, I'm Bohuslav Martinu. I'm a composer. This is my most recent piece for orchestra. I would be honored or something like that if you would consider performing it." And believe it or not, Koussevitzy took the score, went back to America, and programmed it the next season with the Boston Symphony, and thus began a 20-odd year support by Koussevitzy of Martinu. Koussevitzy was an absolute champion of Martinu's music, and Martinu would be nowhere without him. Of course, the first symphony was commissioned by Koussevitzy, so of course we have to begin with him. Two other conductors worth mentioning: Paul Zacher and Charles Munch. Zacher was Swiss, Munch was Alsatian, I believe. They were both very good friends of Martinu and very important, not only supporting his music, but keeping him alive. And that's not an exaggeration. Martinu did not want to leave Paris when it fell to the Nazis in 1940, and he had to be kind of forced out. And he began this months-long sort of exodus, this crazy wandering through France from safe house to safe house, outrunning the Nazis, by whom he was blacklisted. And he ended up at one point, I think, living, really in meager circumstances, cooking his food over a fire, or at least his wife was, Charlotte, who was French. She escaped with him. One point he stayed with Munch on this long journey, and Munch supposedly said to him, trying to cheer him up. I mean, you can imagine Martinu was quite depressed. Who wouldn't be? And he said, "Oh, you can imagine, Bohuslav, you should write a symphony. That'll lift your spirits." Here he is living out of a suitcase. But he eventually did write his symphony right about that time. Zacher is the reason, though, that Martinu made it out of France. Martinu escaped a matter of hours before the Nazis broke down his door. And Zacher urged him out and bought Martinu and Mrs. Martinu's passage from Europe to America. So we have them to thank. When he arrived in America, you can imagine, he says, "I arrived here in a lamentable condition." He's writing to Zacher. "But I have to work a lot since I don't have enough of my music with me, and everybody asks me for scores, which unfortunately remain in Europe, so I have to compose new pieces." Now, I really want to emphasize this. He really had nothing. He was without means, or at least he had means, but he wasn't making money. He needed to survive. All his royalties were shut off. Publishing companies were shut down in Europe. He had none of his scores with him, so when people wanted to play his music to support him, he didn't have anything to give them. I think he had one or two with him. And it became a matter of almost life and death to start writing music, and lots of it, because he wasn't going to be able to survive. In the meantime, he had to learn English, of course. So this is one of those moments where, I should add that the Czech government in exile did give him a stipend of, I believe, $300 a month. So that eased the transition, but he really needed to be writing music. Fortunately, Koussevitzy stepped in and premiered his Concerto Grosso in November of 1941. And this was a smash hit success. There Martinu is with Boulanger and Koussevitzy. He writes, "We're back from Boston, and from my first big concert in America, I had a great success. There was applause. Everyone was enthusiastic, even the orchestra." That one makes me chuckle. "The Boston Symphony is clearly the best orchestra in the world." And then he adds, "I also have to tell you that I got a request from Boston for a big symphony. And then I met with Mrs. Coolidge," I believe Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, that great patroness of the arts, I should say. This Concerto Grosso premiere, though, it really was a catalyst for the commission of Symphony 1. It was so much of a success, the Concerto Grosso, that there's the story that Martinu was coming back on the train from Boston, heading from Boston to New York. And the everyday folks on the train recognized Martinu. Can you imagine? They recognized a living composer by sight and gave him an ovation on the train. That's how big of a deal this was. I can't think of another composer that has happened to in recent years. So anyways, Koussevitzy premieres the Concerto Grosso. That score had to be smuggled through Australia, I think. And it's such a big success that then Boston commissions a big symphony. So Martinu, this is strange, just the timing of this. In that letter to his family, it was November, he said they've already requested it, but then he asks Koussevitzy, or rather tells him in December, that he's going to write a symphony for him. And then it's not until February that Koussevitzy actually accepts, or rather offers, an official commission. And of course, he says, "Please dedicate it to my late wife, Natalie." And Martinu is in good company here. Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra was in memory of Natalie Koussevitzy, and so was the Stravinsky Ode. Now, what did Martinu write for this symphony? It's 4 movements, 35 minutes. You know, this is a big deal. He completed the first movement on May 1st in Jamaica, New York, Long Island. Completed the second in Middlebury, Vermont. That was at the behest of Nadia Boulanger, that she asked him to come up to Vermont. Beautiful countryside. We know it reminded Mrs. Martinu of France. Then the third movement he completed at Mackinac Lake, Massachusetts, a month later. And he completed finally the whole thing at Manomet, Cape Cod. Now, sometimes this is referred to, this piece, as the Spy Symphony, because while he was finishing up the last movement at Cape Cod, he got into a little bit of trouble. Another habit of Martinu's creative process, and he adhered to this religiously, was that he had to walk in order to compose. So he took these hours-long walks every night without fail, because he said it's absolutely necessary for composition. This was such an important thing for Martinu that he one of the Long Island newspapers actually wrote an article when he was in Jamaica working on the first movement, saying, hey, if you see this guy wandering around at night, don't talk to him. He's not lost. He's a composer, and he wants to be left alone. Unfortunately, the Cape Cod newspaper did not publish such a disclaimer. And Martinu was out walking around at the night, and some patriotic citizens reported him. They figured he was a spy. And so Martinu was arrested. And fortunately, his friend bailed him out and said, look, this is a composer and he's not a spy. As a side note, there is some historical precedence for that. Beethoven, I have also heard, was arrested while walking, and they held him in custody, and he said, look, I'm Beethoven. And they said, no, Beethoven wouldn't be dressed so sloppily. And he said, no, seriously, I'm Beethoven. And then one of his friends, I don't know if it was Czerny or Schuppanzig, had to come in and say, no, that actually is Beethoven. And the jailers felt so bad that they bought him new clothes. I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but in any case, Martinu was definitely momentarily arrested because they thought he was a spy. Now, I'm going to emphasize the other one of these locations here that I haven't talked about yet, Mackinac Lake, Massachusetts, very specific lake. What is at Mackinac Lake? Tanglewood. That wonderful bastion of music education and music camp, the Boston University Tanglewood Institute. Now, Martinu was on the faculty in 1942. He actually was on the faculty in 1946 as well. That was another year that one of his nocturnal walks got him into trouble. He was walking around on top of the faculty residence for some reason, and the roof had no guardrails, and he walked off the edge of the building. He almost died. But anyways, that was neither here nor there for our purposes. 1942, he was teaching at Tanglewood. That's a great honor. Koussevitzy ran the Tanglewood Institute, and he asked Aaron Copland and Igor Stravinsky to be the two composers, faculty composers that year. Stravinsky eventually turned him down. Copland accepted. So Koussevitzy's second choice after Stravinsky was Martinu. Not bad company. Stravinsky, Copland, Martinu. And here they all are in this photo. You can see on the left there's Martinu in that middle row of the blown up section, looking rather scowly. And Koussevitzy is here smiling with his armband on. And there's Copland way over to the right. And if you look closely in the bottom right of that leftmost and blown up image, you see a young Leonard Bernstein is tucked away. So what a year to be at Tanglewood. Martinu taught, amongst others, Alan Hovhannes that year and the composer H. Owen Reed. So you can imagine at this point, his tune has kind of changed a little bit of how he feels that he's being accepted in America. He's not so worried. He's had some great performances. He's now teaching. The Americans have accepted me as if I had been here frequently, he said. And they knew about me more than the people in France did, and definitely more than my own country. This is a poignant paragraph. Starting over from square one when you are over 50 is difficult, but not impossible. The mental frame for work is bad. One has to have a lot of courage to work while listening to the news. Despite that, I have not lost my belief in people and in music. I love that. So he wrote that while he was writing the symphony. Now, the world premiere of the Symphony No. 1 took place actually at Harvard University, of all places, on November 12th. There's some discrepancy, but you can see this program here. It was actually November 12th in 1942. And then it was performed twice back at Boston Symphony Hall, once at Yale, Carnegie Hall. That's where Aaron Copland and David Diamond attended. Koussevitzy is supposed to have said, for 25 years, perhaps longer, I've never held such more perfect work in my hands. Now, he also said that about Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra a year later, so we don't know if that was just kind of one of his go-to lines, or if he really thought Martinů, the Martinů First Symphony was the greatest work he had held in his hands until the Concerto for Orchestra came along by Bartók. In either case, it's pretty high praise. Now, Martinů wrote basically an essay for program notes. And I'm not going to go into all of them because I want to actually get into the music now, but a couple excerpts are interesting. It says, Mr. Martinů had never written a symphony before, so in lieu of an analysis, of course, we know how much he hated analysis. His convictions are about the form. So here are his convictions. He says the form of the symphony is one of the great problems of contemporary composers. The Romantic and post-Romantic epochs have elevated the symphony to the highest level of musical composition, and it's certainly not my intention to dispute this. I just want to clarify something. Basically, he says, the symphony is getting too big. There are too many movements. It is too long. It is too overblown. The large proportions, the expansive form of the symphony necessarily force the composer to, here we go again, put himself on a high plane. What I maintain as my deepest conviction is the essential nobility of thoughts and things which are quite simple, and which, not explained in high-sounding words and abstruse phrases, still hold an ethical and human significance. In other words, he believes there is beauty in simplicity. The tendency, the desire to be greater than one is, can lead directly to an emphasis which, to say the least, is not essentially musical. Overemphasis can certainly strain the limits of music and sound, and by sound I mean dynamics. One inevitably comes to the point where the actual instruments can no longer support the weight of an expression which exaggerates dynamism. They cannot support this expression and keep faith with certain aesthetic laws, which we rightly prize. Even the natural capacity of our ears and nerves is strained. There is still another grave consequence: the tendency to mask a lack of real music and to replace it with noise. The result adds nothing to the true beauty of the art, for sheer excitation of the nerves cannot be a worthy aesthetic goal. As for my symphony, it follows the classical division: 4 parts, Allegro, Scherzo, Largo, Allegro. In preserving this plan, I have also followed an aesthetic plan which my conviction dictates. That is, a work of art must not transcend the limits of its possibility and expression. I lived in France long enough to learn what's the significance of measure. I've avoided elements which seem to me alien to the expressive purpose of the work. The basis of the orchestra is in the quintet of the strings, which does not prevent solo passages for the woodwinds, while the brass and percussion fulfill their due part. I've tried to find new sound combinations and to elicit from the orchestra a unified sonority in spite of the polyphonic working which the score contains. We've got a lot to unpack here. He's trying to be balanced. He's trying to be original. He's trying to honor the traditional role of the strings. It is not the sonority, he goes on, of impressionism, nor is there a search for color, which is rather integral in the writing and the formal structure. The character of the work is calm and lyric. So he's telling you a lot about what he wants to do. Let's see how well he lives up to it. Before I play the music, a brief quote from Virgil Thompson again in his review of the symphony. At last, music that sounds like music. It restores one's faith. It really does. The Martinů Symphony is a beaut. It's wholly lovely. It doesn't sound like anything else. Here is a recording score video which features the Czech Philharmonic and Jiří Bělohlavek, 1991. First 3 minutes on play. There's that tranquillo, the calm, again. There is that quintet of strings that we were talking about. Love that piano. So I think the first thing that most people that grabs them about Martinu is his melodic line. He's got a very distinctive sense for melody. Here, this is reproduced from a fantastic book, fantastically thorough, by Michael Crump, Martinu and the Symphony. I'll talk about this a little more in a second. Mr. Crump did an extraordinary service to the music world by tackling this complete reckoning of Martinu's musical language, melodic, harmonic, formal, in terms of his orchestral music, and then specifically in depth each of the 6 symphonies. This is an extraordinary volume. And he has lots of reductions and examples, which I will use here for educational purposes. So this first, kind of melodic theme, it's very syncopated, a lot of people would say. But it looks syncopated on the page. But when you read Martinu's letters and his diaries, you actually come to find out that Martinu heard melodic shapes in what would be called asymmetrical time signatures, not the regular divisions. and then in constantly changing meters as well. For example, I think what Martinu really intended here, and we have his writings to corroborate this, is that he was hearing this in different meters, and he had to put it in 6/8 because he was afraid that conductors wouldn't be able to conduct it. And we actually know this was a good call, for example, from what we know about Aaron Copland's experience with Koussevitzy in the 20s, with Copland's symphonic ode. Koussevitzy could not conduct 5/8 at all. And so it's a good thing that Martinu barred it in 6/8. So I think what we're really hearing is this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, like that. Makes more sense. It seems to flow naturally. Of course, when you lay down this sort of ostinato accompaniment, it you can see becomes much more difficult because your brain is operating on two rhythmic, or rather two metrical levels. So I maintain this really isn't syncopated so much as polymetrical. Two different meters happening at the same time. One constant, the other constantly changing. What a amazing kaleidoscopic effect. Now let's dig into the material here a little bit. This is taken from the same book, the Martinů and the Symphony by Michael Crump. He claimed that for months he was troubled by a sequence of two chords, a succession of B minor and B major, which you'll remember is in the opening of that. That's the, I suppose it was. In the opening. And so he was troubled. What was troubling? Well, it struck him as an unsuitable opening for his symphony. Once he had solved the problem of how to get past these chords, the form of the first movement became clear. This is still Crump saying this. His objection had been that it was not possible to base a theme on two chords. Then Mr. Crump writes, he escaped his dilemma by using the chords to launch an introductory passage of evolving harmonies, which returns at the end of the movement, rather than as the basis of a true theme. Now this, I'm going to investigate a little bit this claim. Of course, Mr. Crump wrote this book before the English translation, Svatosh's translation, came out, and we understood what Martinu was really trying to do with his pieces, and we get a better sense of what Martinu thought of analytically. But still, there were his program notes out there that Mr. Crump quotes. And so one of the great things I think about this book is that Mr. Crump tries very, very hard to create analyses that honor Martinu's understanding of music and aren't just dry, theoretical kind of building blocks. However, I think Mr. Crump misses the boat here a little bit in terms of his understanding of the form of the first movement. I really believe, to use Martinu's terminology, I think his struggle was he had found a motif before he had found a feeling for the whole. He liked this opening, this rising D to D sharp, or Re to Re sharp, to use solfege, but he couldn't figure out what he was doing with it. And once his feeling for the whole set in his mind, then he was able to compose. And knowing that he loves simple building blocks, I think this symphony is an investigation of the minor second, or rather, how Martinu chose to solve his gestalt was by employing the minor second in as many ways as possible. So let me show you what I mean. Here's the first 2.5 pages of the symphony. There is that first minor second leap. Here are all the minor seconds on the first page alone. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, Jacob, you can't just analyze a piece based on minor seconds. They're everywhere. That is true. However, when you start digging in further, you start to realize maybe there's something here. It's sort of the glue that holds the whole piece together. So yeah, it's a little overkill to point out every minor second. I admit that. But the ways in which he uses them strategically, I don't think can be overlooked. He even uses them harmonically. Here we have a set of 3 chords that he's dealing with. A Mi flat dominant 7th chord, Do major chord, and then a La 7 dominant. And those overlap each other. They have many tones in common. They also create a lot of minor seconds. And that whole page harmonically deals with them. You can see Do is in green, La is in blue, and Mi flat is in red, and they shift back and forth. Of course, even the voice leading moves by a minor second, that outer, or you can look right in the trumpets. The Mi flat in the Mi flat chord goes up by a minor second to the Mi natural in the Do major chord. And then the Do goes up by a minor second to get to the Do sharp in the La major chord. It's just everywhere. Even the bass line down there, the big final push is from a Do to a Do sharp, which is a half step up from the C or the B, as you would say in regular letter names, that opens the piece. And in that one melodic example, it's everywhere. In the ostinato, of course, it's all over the thematic material. Even what is called cross relations, they create minor seconds of sorts. Now, the big question I raise with Michael Crump's analysis here is he lists a series of themes for this movement, which are basically different melodic areas, and he tries to create a form out of them. And he comes to the conclusion basically that it's unsuccessful, that there are too many themes and not enough repetition. I would agree with him, but I would also say I don't think that's what Martinu was trying to do. So it fails if you're trying to look for themes that have identity. For example, he complains, this is the only theme that's repeated. That's not true, actually. The most significant theme that's repeated is the opening, but also the part with the strings. I'll show that in a second. But he said, isn't it a shame that the theme with the least thematic identity is the one that's repeated? I think the exact opposite is happening. This is the theme that most clearly shows the minor second. Minor second, over, up, a minor second. I think that's repeated because it's essential for an understanding of the movement. Martinu is showing you what he's doing. Here, look at this. I don't think it's an accident either that this is the only theme that fits perfectly into 6/8. Here's another quote from the book. Theme upon theme has arisen only to fall back into the mire, the swamp of auxiliary patterns. This procedure is extraordinarily unusual, but not, I feel, particularly successful. The listener by now is floundering, having been given no real clue to the formal outline of the movement. Everything about the opening section is suggestive of decay. I feel very strongly the opposite. I never felt lost or floundering when I first heard this movement, and I do not think of it as decay at all. Before I get into why, a little quote from Martinu about why I think it is dangerous to analyze based on themes. While he was writing the symphony, remember, he was teaching at Tanglewood. One of his students at Tanglewood, as I mentioned, in 1942, was H. Owen Reed. He relayed the story as quoted in Svatosh's translation. And in books, Svatos wrote essays as well with this. He once asked Martinu how he worked with themes. To this, Martinu replied, "I don't work with themes." So what does he work with then? So what does Martinu work with instead of themes? Why is the opening not about decay, and how can you find your way through it? For comparison, here is kind of the outline that Mr. Crump outlines in his book. A prelude. I think the prelude is the essential understanding of this movement, then a bunch of themes. I offer an alternative analysis. I believe, as I've already said, the key to this movement is the minor second. So what does Martinu use instead of themes? He uses a motif which he presents, and then he gives us alternating sections of what I call melodic investigation, where he goes, well, let's see what I can do with this, right? So all those themes that Crump highlights it's fantastic. He can certainly see what's going on. But Martinu, I don't think, wants us to think of those necessarily as primary theme, secondary theme, this thing. You know, it's not a certain form. It's this living organism, a living form, he would say. So you get a motif, and then you say, look at all these different ways that I can use this motif. And then he goes back, measure 137, and he clarifies, okay, there's that motif again, just so we're on the same page. This is what I'm dealing with. Then he goes into a new section of melodic investigation, way down in the low strings, really ambiguous section. Then again, bring it back. That's the theme that Crump pointed out was repeated. You notice I highlight the section of strings. We remember in the excerpt we heard, it ends with this really powerful only strings, big polyphonic section. I think this is really important. Martinu repeats that literally. We're talking 10 measures, 11 measures, like copy and pasted. That is significant. That tells you that this is important. This is very, very important. The only other part of the piece that he literally repeats is that same music from the beginning, those 10 measures again, or 11, 10 measures. He repeats it exactly at the end. So what we end up getting is this beautiful amalgamated form is happening on so many different levels. We have this sort of Renaissance Baroque ritornello form where you have a motivic exposition, then you investigate it, then you have another motivic exposition, you investigate it back and forth. But there's also this axis of symmetry in the middle. And you know, we know from study of music from the Baroque era, there's always an axis of symmetry in ritornello forms. But it also leads to a sort of arch form, which is usually associated with Bartók, this idea that, you know, I color-coded based on the relationships. So the blue is in the outer, the green is the next to outer, the melodic investigation, and the middle. Then you have that strings that provides great symmetry and balance. And then you have restatements of the motif. It's beautifully and very, very clearly organized. It's balanced, and I think this is a much more I think this understanding of this movement is more in line with what Martinu would have thought, at least as far as we know, of what his priorities were and what he was trying to do with his composition. So like I said, he brings back what we heard before at the end, and let me play that for you now. This is the ending of that movement. Remember the strings, remember the motif, remember the melodic investigation, and remember that opening B minor to B major. There are those strings. are related to melodies we heard earlier. And there's that theme again. And finally, isn't that just sublime? I just love that. And of course, the last things the strings play, minor second, leap, minor second. I think I forgot to mention this on the previous slide with my form. In addition to arch form and ritornello form and all those wonderful layers of stability, Martinu still gives us what Schoenberg kind of coined the phrase, talking about Brahms, developing variation. There's this constant sense of growth, of evolution, which is perfectly in line, I think, with Martinu's idea of living form, of a living organism. So he gives us structure, but it's living structure, it's living form. I don't know of any other composer that does that so well, at least not since Brahms or Bach, I suppose. I shouldn't be so hasty to make a pronouncement, but suffice it to say, Martinu, I believe, does it quite well. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go as deep into the other movements of this symphony as I did into the first. And admittedly, I could go much deeper. There are many more connections. He brings back themes, for example, at one point, which are altered by a minor second from their original statement. There are large-scale transpositions of a minor second. The whole movement goes from B minor to B major, or to use solfege, C minor to C major. But in the interest of time, let's move on and just catch a couple more excerpts from the ending. I want to circle back to this idea of perceived meter, that Martinu was writing melodic gestures that didn't conform to the meter that he wrote them in. This is the opening theme. Ooh, there I said it. Yikes. The opening melodic material of the second movement. Whoop. That's what I get for trying to play left-handed. This theme, this melody, I've always loved. This is one of my, since I was a boy, I love this yum, ba, ba, beep, ba, yum. It's so alive and fun. But I always thought of it like this. I figured this was 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is how Martinu writes it. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Of course, it's ludicrous to try to count it like that because we know he was really thinking 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2. But on the score, my goodness, I've heard people really say, my goodness, it's a pain to play these symphonies by Martinu, or any music for that matter, because you're hearing something that your eyes aren't seeing. And yet when it clicks, it's glorious. Here's the opening of the second movement, the scherzo. Pay attention, by the way, pay attention to what is happening in the first few bars before those flute and piano notes come in. And about putting on So did you catch it? The opening before the flutes and piano come in? It's minor seconds. How about that? I find it very hard that was coincidence. Of course, there are a bunch of minor seconds buried in the strings, pits. And then the biggest one of all, the jarring, shocking one, is what happens after those first 6 measures. We're again in a B tonality, or C again to use solfege. And then all of a sudden, we're just suddenly, boom, we're a half step lower. This is almost as if he was trying to compensate maybe for the opening of the first movement, which rises a half step. And in this opening, falls. Who knows? Now, I want to talk about one more harmonic gesture, which this is very near and dear to my heart as well. Martinu uses this constantly. It's been dubbed the Moravian cadence, Moravian. I believe Harry Halbrecht is the one that coined that term, the first real cataloger of Martinu's music. What it is, we've already heard this in the first movement, and we're about to hear a couple in the third movement. It's a cadence that follows a shape that's commonly found at the end of Moravian folk songs, which is namely this kind of slowing down from second scale degree to the first, and usually accompanied by a sort of pickup ahead of time. So you can imagine kind of a 5/7 to 1. But there's this particular harmonization that Martinu uses that really comes from Janáček, Leos Janáček, Taras Bulba, which is an astounding piece of music he wrote in 1918, the same year that Martinu wrote his own Czech Rhapsody. And this is here, you get this leap. Look at that. There's sort of some objectionable parallels there. Martinu's voice leading is better than Janáček's. He resolves every voice by step, as you can see in that example on the right from the first movement. excuse me, except for the bass. But often Martinu will resolve it into a 6/4 inversion. He uses this progression constantly. He first used it in his opera Juilliard in 1937, and in basically every major work he wrote afterwards. I've certainly used it in many of my music, my own compositions. Here's a more theoretical understanding. It's this sort of, Martinu occasionally, well, actually more than occasionally, will put two side by side and use that top voice as a non-chord tone, as a suspension, for example. You can see there the scale degrees I've shown how they resolve. You got second scale degree going down to 1, sixth scale degree going down to 5, all stepwise. Now for some contrary motion, he writes it as a flat third scale degree. It's really a sharp second scale degree. It resolves, it acts that way. And then the bass, which often resolves up, can also resolve down. Love it. I absolutely love it. Of course, there are some minor seconds there. Let's see how he uses this in the third movement, which is the opening. I mean, it can hold its own against any largo. It's just beautifully expressive. Was one Moravian. Just super. Just wonderful. Of course, we have to talk about minor seconds, since that's what I'm on about here. At first, it doesn't look like we have anything. It's just a B-flat minor triad way down. But look what's alternating. What's the most shocking note out of those first 4 notes? 1, 2. The sol flat going to the sol natural. That's what stands out. That. Bunch of minor seconds, and it even goes up later and back down. Now, there are even more layers here. We have the Mi flat, and then halfway through, the lowest note rises up to a Mi natural, then up to a Fa, then up to a Fa sharp. We have a third layer here with C flats and C natural, or B flat and B natural in note names. And finally, a fourth layer of the do going to a do sharp, going to a re. It shows us the organization that's happening, which for Martinu assuredly was organic and natural. And yet, when anything is organic and natural, there is great structure behind it and structural integrity. Now onto the last movement. You know what I'm going to say. Look out for minor seconds. Let's see if we find any. I hate to end it. I really do. Of course, there are minor seconds galore. All the red involve sol and fa sharp, and all the yellow involve la flat and sol. Of course, we even get one dragged out in the horns up there at concert pitch, or rather. So it's even there. Every movement begins with some blatant presentation of that Urmotiv, to be German about it. I know Martinu would hate that I use a German expression, but it is what it's the key, is that minor second. I think it's the key to unlocking this entire symphony, and you can trace it everywhere. There's always more to find. I mean, I could spend a whole lifetime looking for minor seconds in this symphony. It just shows his craft, I think. And it's not just technique, as he said, but it's a love for his profession. He's trying to make this music as full of integrity as possible. And that's what I love about it. And there's something to always, it's the same thing, just in different ways. I was just talking a few days ago with my current teacher, John Corigliano, and I asked him why economy was so important in music. And he, without flinching, he said, because music happens in time. It's no, it's imperative that people can get it as it goes by. And that's our job as composers, is to show people exactly what we mean. And when Martinu can take a 35-minute piece and make it all about a minor second and make it interesting and varied, but you're always coming back to that same thing, it's brilliant. That really is what I strive for in my own music. Of course, now there are going to be a lot of people that say, oh, come on. Yeah, okay, there's minor seconds everywhere. Does that mean that he was really consciously thinking about it? The answer I would give, which is from one of my composition professors at Vanderbilt, Michael Rose, he would say it doesn't matter if he consciously thought about it or not. What matters is that it's there. And Dr. Rose certainly had a tremendous influence on my understanding of analysis. Not analysis for analysis' sake, but analysis for the joy of it, for understanding the living form of a composition. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out the biggest minor second in this entire piece, which is its tonal structure. It starts B natural, C natural, and would you believe it ends half step down in B flat major. Let's take a listen to this ending. It is quite fun. Oh, it's just glorious. It's just glorious. You know, Maestro Bielohlavek does the best job, I think, out of the recordings I've heard of getting that a Celerando at the end. It really needs to be really, really cooking. From my understanding, not who am I to question these conductors, but I've always thought, man, it would be wonderful someday to be able to hear this piece live and to feel the sensation and to see if the conductor really does a full Celerando, to really just push it all the way as fast as possible at the end. I thought, well, it's never going to happen. Well, fortunately, it is going to happen. Thanks to one of the most remarkable, insightful, and energetic conductors out there right now, Czech, Jakub Hrůša. Maestro Hrůša is coming to New York in February, and this is just a screenshot from the New York Philharmonic's website. Yes, Yuja Wang is going to be performing the list for his piano concerto, but if you look way down in the fine print, Martinu's richly textured First Symphony. So finally, the New York Philharmonic is going to perform this exceptional symphony, much neglected. And I am ecstatic. I'll be there in person, and we can see how well Maestro Hrůša handles his tempi, although judging by his exceptional recordings in the past, he will do an outstanding job. He, in fact, is a scholar on his own right, in his own right. I just got this in the mail a few weeks ago. I'm excited to read it. It's his essays on Martinu, which should be extraordinarily insightful in both Czech and English. I admire Maestro Hrůša's interpretations tremendously, and this will, I'm sure, show a little more of what he's thinking. This is just one of many things in the resurgence of interest in Martinu that I'm so glad to see. The big one for me right now, living in New York, is that this year has been the year of Bohuslav Martinu, the 80th anniversary of his coming to America, March 31st, 1941. This is now 2021. And the Czech consulate, the Czech Center, has done a wonderful job of sponsoring initiatives relating to Martinu, which I'm just delighted to see, and I'm grateful to them for that interest. Of course, I have to mention too the Bohuslav Martinu complete edition by Bärenreiter, that most austere of publishing companies. This is scheduled to be completed, I believe, in 2067 or something like that. It's finally a complete authoritative urtext, entire edition of Martinu's entire compositional oeuvre. And I have subscribed to the chamber section of that, so I get to have my own copies. It's that is so great to see. I think, really in conclusion, what all this renewed interest shows me, and what I hope to convey simply in this presentation, is that Martinu is, I think, really essential for an understanding of 20th century music, simply because he didn't get caught up in the trends. He was really a personal, individual composer that, as a friend of mine once said, recently told me, he's an engineering student at MIT. He said, oh, all I do is take things that already exist and arrange them in new ways. I don't invent anything. And that's exactly what I try to do with my composition, and that's what Martinu does. There's nothing entirely innovative, and yet it's so fresh. It is so new. The way he can synthesize new ways, and of course there are many composers that do this to great success, and you can listen to Stravinsky, Bartók, and all that. But Martinu's sense of rhythm and sense of humanity and harmony and dance, and yet it's still accessible, and it's okay. Personally, that's a personal taste. I can go on about that. But all that aside, he is essential for a complete understanding of the 20th century music, simply because he wasn't a populist, he wasn't a neoclassicist necessarily, he wasn't a serialist, he just tried to write good music. And when you read his writings, like I said before, it's an alternative understanding of music history from the composer's mouth. And I urge every musician out there, every teacher, to buy, get one of these books, read what he had to say, open your mind to a new understanding of music. Martinu has been unfairly neglected, certainly for too long, and I think the popularity that he enjoyed while he was still alive is not a thing of the past. It is certainly possible today. At the very least, I'd hope that that people can feel what Paul Sacher once said. And this is a man who knew Bartók, Stravinsky, all of them. And yet he said, in all my life, I've never met a man so simple, so direct, so impressive as Bohuslav Martinu. Of course, Martinu would hate the composer taking precedent over the music. All he was doing was writing good music. And I know he wouldn't want to be honored over his music. But I think the same adjectives ring true for Martinu's music. I have never heard music so simple, so direct, and yet so impressive.